The first thing I noticed was that my mother had stopped saying my brother's name. Not because they were fighting, not because something had happened between them, but because every time his name came up, she would suddenly find a reason to leave the room. At first I thought it was grief. My father had died 8 months earlier, and grief had changed all of us in different ways. My mother became quieter. My brother Ryan stopped coming home for Sunday dinners. I buried myself in work because being busy was easier than admitting how much I missed my father. Then, one Saturday morning, I found an envelope inside the drawer of my father's old desk. It was addressed to me, but there was no stamp, no date, and no return address. Just my name written in my father's handwriting. I opened it expecting a letter about his funeral arrangements, or some sentimental message he'd never had the courage to say while he was alive. Instead, there was a single sentence. If you ever discover what happened to Daniel, don't believe the story your mother tells you. I read it 3 times. Daniel. I hadn't heard that name in our family for 23 years. I had been 6 years old when my mother told me Daniel was a cousin who had moved away. But suddenly my father's final message made no sense. Who was Daniel really? Why had my father warned me about my mother? And why had he waited until after his death to tell me? I carried the letter downstairs and found my mother standing at the kitchen counter cutting apples. She looked at the paper in my hand and dropped the knife. "Where did you get that?" she asked. "Dad's desk." Her face changed instantly. "You shouldn't have opened it." I stared at her. "Who was Daniel?" She didn't answer. "Mom." She wiped her hands on a towel. "This isn't something you need to know. Dad specifically told me I needed to know." She looked away. "Your father was sick at the end. He wasn't thinking clearly." That was the first lie. I knew it immediately because my father had written the letter only 2 weeks before he died, and his handwriting was steady. He had known exactly what he was doing. I asked her again. "Who was Daniel?" she whispered. "Someone from before." "Before what?" "Before you." Then she walked out of the kitchen. I stood there holding the letter, feeling the strange sensation that comes when one small piece of information suddenly makes your entire childhood look different. My family had always been the kind that kept old things. My mother saved every birthday card. My father kept receipts from restaurants we visited on vacations. We had boxes of Christmas ornaments, school projects, report cards, photographs, and old VHS tapes in the basement. If someone had asked me whether my family had secrets, I would have laughed. Of course, every family had small secrets, but not a person, not a whole human being whose name had disappeared from conversation for more than 20 years. That afternoon, I went through my father's desk again. I found tax documents, insurance papers, old photographs, and finally a small black notebook hidden beneath a stack of manuals. Most of the pages contained ordinary notes, measurements for furniture, names of clients, phone numbers. But toward the back I found a page with one word written repeatedly, Daniel. Underneath it was a date, September 3rd, 2001, then another date, October 18th, 2001, then another, November 12th, December 7th, January 4th, 2002. The entries continued for almost a year. I turned the page and found an address. I recognized it immediately. It was the address of the house where my grandmother had lived before she died. I remembered that house. I remembered visiting her there. I remembered the smell of cinnamon and old books. But I didn't remember Daniel. I called Ryan. He answered after the 4th ring. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Who was Daniel?" There was silence, not confusion. Silence. Then he said, "Where did you hear that name?" I told him about Dad's letter. He exhaled slowly. "You found it." "Found what?" "Nothing. Ryan." He didn't answer. "Did you know about Daniel?" Another silence. Finally he said, "I knew there was something Dad didn't want us talking about." "That's not what I asked." "I know. Did you know him?" "No." "Then why are you scared?" He said quietly, "Because Mom told me never to look for him." I felt my stomach tighten. Why? She said he was dangerous. That answer should have satisfied me. It didn't. There was something about the way Ryan said it, as though he didn't believe it himself. I asked him to come over. He refused. Instead, he said something that made me realize the secret was bigger than either of us had imagined. "Claire, whatever you find, don't assume Dad was the good guy." Then he hung up. That night I barely slept. The next morning, I drove to my grandmother's old house. The property had been sold years earlier, but the current owner was an elderly man who remembered my family. When I showed him my father's notebook, he stared at the address and said, "I haven't heard that name in years." "Daniel?" I asked. He nodded. "Your family had a boy staying here once." My heart stopped. "What boy?" He looked at me. "I assumed he was your brother." I almost laughed. "I only have one brother." The man shook his head. "No, there was another." He told me that in the fall of 2001, a young boy had lived at my grandmother's house for several months. My father visited frequently. My mother came only once. The boy slept in the upstairs bedroom. He was quiet, had dark hair, and rarely spoke to neighbors. Then one morning he was gone. Where did he go? I asked. Your father took him. I stared at him. Are you sure? I remember because your father came here in the rain. He carried 2 bags. The boy was holding his hand. I asked if he remembered the boy's age. Maybe 8. 8 years old. My age in 2001 was 6. Ryan was 12. Daniel wasn't a cousin. He was a child who had lived with my grandmother while my father secretly visited him. I returned home and found my mother waiting in the driveway. She had somehow known where I was. You went to your grandmother's house. I stopped the car. Yes. She looked exhausted. Why? Because you won't tell me the truth. She stepped closer. Some truths don't fix anything. Maybe not, but lies destroy things. She closed her eyes. Your father had another son. I couldn't breathe. Daniel? She nodded. Your father's first child. Before you? Yes. Then why did everyone say he was a cousin? Because that was easier. Easier for who? She didn't answer. I felt anger rising. Where is he? She whispered. We don't know. You don't know? Not anymore. What happened? She looked toward the house. Your father found him when he was 7. Found him where? In foster care. The story came out slowly. Before my parents married, my father had been involved with a woman named Laura. They had a son, Daniel. When Daniel was 2, Laura disappeared with him. My father searched for them but eventually stopped after police told him there was nothing more they could do. Years later, after my parents had married and had Ryan, my father received a letter saying Laura had died. Daniel was in foster care. My father went looking for him. He found him. He brought him to my grandmother's house because my mother refused to let Daniel into our home. Why? I asked. My mother began crying. Because I was afraid. Of a child? Of what he represented. She admitted she had known about Daniel before she married my father. She had agreed to the marriage believing the past was over. When Daniel reappeared, she felt threatened. She was afraid that my father would leave us. Afraid that Ryan and I would love Daniel. Afraid that the family she'd built would become something she couldn't control. So you sent him away? I asked. No. Then who did? She looked at me. Your father. That was the second major lie. My father's notebook proved he had been trying to help Daniel, not abandon him. But my mother insisted there was more. Your father wanted to take him back permanently, she said. He wanted custody. Then why didn't he? Because Daniel told the social worker something. My mother stopped. What? He said he didn't want to live with your father. I couldn't understand. Why? She looked down. Because Daniel said your father had hurt him. The words hit me like a punch. Suddenly the story changed. Maybe my father wasn't the misunderstood hero. Maybe he had found his first son, and then done something terrible. Maybe my mother had been protecting us all these years. I wanted to believe that explanation, because it was simpler than everything else. But something didn't fit. My father had left me a warning. If Daniel had accused him, why would Dad tell me to question Mom? I returned to his notebook. There were dozens of entries about Daniel, but one line caught my attention. He still believes I abandoned him. I need to find out who told him that. Beneath it was another name. Martha. Martha was my grandmother. I remembered her being protective of my mother. She had never liked my father. As a child, I assumed it was because he was stubborn. Now I wondered if she knew more. I searched through my grandmother's old belongings and found a photograph of Daniel. It was tucked behind a framed picture of my mother. On the back, my grandmother had written, "He cannot know yet." I turned the photograph over again. Daniel was standing beside my father. He looked about 8. But there was something else in the picture. A woman stood in the background. I recognized her from my father's notebook. Martha's friend, Helen. I searched the name and found an old obituary. Helen had died 5 years earlier, but her daughter Melissa still lived in town. I drove to her house. She almost closed the door when I mentioned my grandmother. "I don't want to talk about that family," she said. "Please, I just need to know about Daniel." She stared at me for several seconds before letting me inside. Then she told me the part nobody in my family had ever known. Daniel had never accused my father of hurting him. He had accused him of abandoning him. There was a difference. When Daniel was 7, he had overheard my grandmother telling him that his father didn't really want him. She had convinced him that my father only took him in because he felt guilty. Then, when my father tried to bring him home, Daniel believed he was being forced into a family that didn't want him. He ran away from the house. My father found him 2 days later. Daniel begged him not to send him back to foster care. My father promised he wouldn't. But when my mother discovered the plan, she gave my father an ultimatum. Either Daniel stayed away, or she would leave with Ryan and me. My father made the worst decision of his life. He chose silence. He arranged for Daniel to be placed with another family. Then he told everyone Daniel had disappeared, but he never stopped searching. I asked Melissa where Daniel was now. She hesitated. I think you should ask your mother. She doesn't know. Melissa looked at me. She knows more than she told you. Then she gave me an address. I drove there that evening. It was a small house on the outskirts of town. A man answered the door. He was in his early 30s, dark hair, brown eyes, a faint scar near his left eyebrow. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew. Daniel? I asked. He stared at me. Who are you? I'm Claire. His expression changed. He didn't speak. Then he whispered, Robert's daughter. I nodded. You knew about me? I've known about you for years. My chest tightened. Why didn't you contact me? He looked away. Because your father asked me not to. He knew where you were? For the last 6 years. I stepped inside. There were photographs on the wall. A wedding picture. 2 little girls. A woman smiling beside him. A normal life. A life my family had never known existed. Daniel made coffee while I sat at the kitchen table. He told me that my father had found him again when he was 25. They had met secretly several times. My father wanted to tell Ryan and me. Daniel refused. Why? I asked. Because I didn't want to become the family scandal. He laughed bitterly. Your father had spent his whole life trying to make everyone happy. I didn't want to be another thing he failed at. I asked him about the accusation that he'd been hurt by our father. He shook his head. I never said that. Then why did Mom say you did? He looked at me. Because your mother needed you to believe I was dangerous. I felt anger flood through me. Why? Because if I was dangerous, then keeping me away from you was protection. If I was just your brother, then she had to admit she had spent 20 years hiding me. I couldn't argue with that. Daniel went to another room and returned with a box. Inside were letters, dozens of them. My father had written them over the years. Birthday letters, Christmas letters, apologies, stories about Ryan and me. He had written about my first day of school, Ryan's graduation, my mother's illness, family vacations, every major moment. Daniel had received none of them until years later. Why do you have them? I asked. Dad gave them to me. When? The last time I saw him. He handed me one. The letter was dated 2 months before my father's death. I opened it. Daniel, I spent 20 years believing silence would protect everyone. It didn't. It only taught all of us to live with missing pieces. Your sisters deserve the truth. Ryan deserves the truth. Your mother deserves the truth. And I need you to know that leaving you was the greatest regret of my life. I couldn't stop crying. Daniel sat across from me. He wanted to tell you. Why didn't he? Because he was afraid. Of Mom? Of losing you. I looked at him. You could have come to us. He nodded. I know. Then he said something that broke me. But every time I thought about knocking on your door, I remembered being 8 years old and wondering why my father chose everyone else. We sat in silence. For the first time I understood that Daniel wasn't just a secret my family had hidden. He was a person who had spent 20 years wondering why he wasn't enough to be chosen. I returned home the next morning and confronted my mother. I placed the letters on the table. She looked at them and started shaking. He found you. Yes. She closed her eyes. I knew he would. Why did you lie? She cried. Because I was selfish. I expected excuses. She gave me none. She admitted she had spent 20 years convincing herself that she was protecting our family, but deep down she was protecting herself. She had been afraid that if Daniel came back, my father would realize what he had lost. She was afraid that Ryan and I would blame her. She was afraid of becoming the villain in a story she had spent years rewriting. You made me hate a man I had never met, I said. I know. You made Ryan carry this secret. I know. You let Dad die believing he couldn't tell us. Her voice broke. I know. Then she said something I wasn't prepared for. Your father didn't leave that letter for you because he wanted you to hate me. I looked at her. Then why? Because he knew I would never tell you. That sentence destroyed whatever anger I had left, not because I forgave her, but because I finally understood the scale of the fear inside our family. Everyone had spent years waiting for someone else to be brave enough to tell the truth. My father waited. My mother waited. Daniel waited. Ryan waited. And I was the one who accidentally opened the door. But discovering the truth didn't magically repair everything. Ryan was furious with me for finding Daniel. He said I had destroyed the family. I told him the family had been cracked long before I found the secret. He didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. My mother moved into my aunt's house because she couldn't bear being in the home where my father had lived. Daniel refused to attend family gatherings, and for a while I wondered whether knowing the truth had actually made everything worse. Then one evening Ryan called. Can I come over? I said yes. He arrived carrying one of my father's old boxes. He put it on the floor and sat down. I found something. Inside was a home video. My father had recorded it 20 years earlier. Ryan and I were children. My mother was in the kitchen. Daniel was sitting on the porch. My father was behind the camera. He wasn't talking to us. He was filming Daniel. Daniel was smiling at something off camera. Then my father's voice said, "One day you'll understand why I couldn't bring him home." The video ended. Ryan looked at me. I thought Dad abandoned him. So did I. I don't think he did. We watched the video again, then again. And for the first time since the secret came out, Ryan cried. He cried because he realized our father hadn't chosen one family over another. He had spent 20 years trying to keep two broken families from destroying each other, and had failed both. A month later, the four of us met at the house where my father had lived. My mother, Ryan, Daniel, me. There was an empty chair at the table, my father's chair. Nobody knew what to say. Finally, Daniel looked at my mother. "I don't hate you," she began crying. "I know you have every reason to." "I do," he paused, "but I don't want to spend the rest of my life carrying it." My mother reached across the table. Daniel didn't take her hand immediately. Then, slowly, he did. Ryan watched them. I watched my brother and realized that family isn't always the people who behaved perfectly. Sometimes it's the people who hurt each other, tell the truth too late, and then have to decide whether the truth is the beginning of the end or the beginning of something new. Daniel never moved into our family home. He didn't suddenly become part of every holiday. We didn't pretend 20 years hadn't happened. Instead, we started small. Coffee on Sundays, phone calls, birthdays, stories about our father. Daniel told us about the years we'd missed. We told him about the years he'd missed. Sometimes it hurt. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes one of us had to leave the room because the weight of what had happened became too much. But slowly, the silence became less powerful. 6 months after we found him, Daniel brought his daughters to meet us. They were young, energetic, and completely unaware that the adults standing around them had spent most of their lives afraid of one another. My mother knelt down and hugged them. Then she looked at me and smiled through tears. "Your father would have loved this." I believed her. There are still things I wish had happened differently. I wish my father had told me the truth while he was alive. I wish my mother had trusted us enough to handle the truth. I wish Daniel had grown up knowing he was wanted. I wish Ryan had never been forced to carry a secret as a teenager. But wishing doesn't rewrite history. What we can do is decide what happens after the truth arrives. I used to think discovering my family's secret had destroyed everything. In the beginning it did. It destroyed the version of my family I believed in. It destroyed the stories I'd told myself about my parents. It destroyed the idea that people who love you will always tell you the truth. But eventually I understood something more complicated. The truth didn't destroy my family. The truth exposed what the secret had already done. And once we could finally see the damage, we had a chance to stop repeating it. Today there is a photograph hanging in my living room. It was taken 20 years ago. My father is standing in the center. Ryan is beside him. I am sitting on the steps, and Daniel is standing slightly behind everyone, as though he isn't sure he belongs in the frame. I keep that photograph because now I see something I didn't see as a child. Daniel wasn't standing behind us because he didn't belong. He was standing there because nobody had made room for him yet. And sometimes I think that's what family secrets really do. They don't erase people. They push them into the background until everyone forgets they were supposed to be standing beside you. If you discovered that someone you loved had hidden a life-changing truth from you for 20 years, would you want to know everything, even if the truth shattered the family you thought you knew? Or would you believe some secrets are better left buried? Tell me what you would do. And if this story made you think about the things families sometimes leave unsaid, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. There are more stories ahead about secrets, choices, and the truths that arrive when people least expect them.